I'm Eleanor Hartwell, 68 years old, and I've spent my entire life believing that showing love meant being endlessly available, constantly giving, and never asking for anything in return. That belief nearly destroyed me when the people I'd sacrificed everything for told me I was too needy for wanting basic acknowledgement of my existence. What happened next changed everything I thought I knew about family, loyalty, and where I should be directing my attention and resources. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The phone call that shattered my world came on a dreary Thursday morning in October, while I was arranging fresh chrysanthemums from my garden in the crystal vase my late husband Thomas had given me for our 25th wedding anniversary. I'd been up since 5, as was my habit, preparing homemade soup for my daughter-in-law Janet, who'd mentioned feeling under the weather, and baking fresh bread for my son Michael's family. The kitchen counter was covered with care packages I'd assembled for each of my 3 children, filled with their favorite treats, household items I thought they might need, and small gifts I'd picked up throughout the week, just because something reminded me of them. When the phone rang, I assumed it was one of them calling to thank me for the surprise delivery I'd planned for later that day, or perhaps asking for help with something, and trained them well over the years to see me as their go-to solution for every problem, their reliable source of emotional support, financial assistance, and practical help. I wiped my flour-covered hands on my apron and answered with the warm, cheerful voice I always used when speaking to my children. Instead, I heard Michael's wife Janet's voice, but it wasn't the grateful, affectionate tone I'd expected. Her voice was clipped, businesslike, and carried an undertone of irritation that made my stomach clench with immediate anxiety. "Eleanor," she said without any pleasantries, "we need to have a conversation about your behavior lately. Michael and I have been discussing it, and frankly, we're concerned about how needy you've become for attention and validation from our family." I felt the blood drain from my face as I gripped the phone tighter, my mind racing to understand what I could have possibly done wrong. "Needy for attention," I repeated, my voice barely above a whisper. "Janet, I don't understand what you mean. I've always just tried to be helpful and involved in your lives because I love you all." "That's exactly the problem," she continued, her tone growing more assertive. "You're constantly inserting yourself into our lives, always wanting to be included in every decision, every event, every conversation. Yesterday you called 3 times just to check on us, and last week you showed up unannounced with dinner when we'd already ordered takeout. It's becoming suffocating, Eleanor. We need space to live our own lives without constantly managing your emotional needs." Each word hit me like a physical blow. I stared out my kitchen window at the bird feeder I filled religiously every morning, watching a cardinal pecking at seeds while my world crumbled around me. The care packages I'd spent hours preparing suddenly looked pathetic sitting on my counter, evidence of my desperate attempts to maintain connection with people who apparently saw my love as a burden rather than a gift. "But I just want to be part of your lives," I managed to say, my voice shaking. "I want to help and support you." "Is wanting to spend time with my family really such a terrible thing?" "It's not about spending time together," Janet replied with what sounded like practiced patience, as if she'd rehearsed this conversation. "It's about your expectation. You expect us to call you every day, to include you in every plan, to drop everything when you want to talk or visit. You get upset when we don't respond to your texts immediately, and you take it personally when we make decisions without consulting you first. It's emotionally exhausting for all of us." I felt tears beginning to burn behind my eyes as I processed her words. Was I really so demanding? I thought back over the past few weeks, trying to see my actions through their eyes instead of my own. The daily phone calls I made because I genuinely cared about their well-being, the surprise visits because I missed them and wanted to brighten their day, the texts checking in because I worried when I didn't hear from them. All of these gestures, which I'd believed were expressions of love, were apparently being interpreted as neediness and emotional manipulation. "Janet," I said carefully, trying to keep my voice steady, "I had no idea you felt this way. I thought my involvement was welcome. I thought you appreciated having someone who cared so much about your family's happiness and success." There was a long pause before she responded, and when she did, Her voice had taken on an edge that felt deliberately cruel. Eleanor, we've been talking as a family, and we think you need to redirect your attention and energy toward people who might be more appreciative of that level of involvement. Maybe you should focus on finding some friends your own age, or perhaps consider volunteering somewhere. We love you, but we need boundaries, and frankly, your constant need for attention and validation is becoming a problem we can't continue to manage. The casual dismissal in her voice, the way she spoke about my love and concern as if they were character flaws that needed to be managed rather than gifts to be treasured, left me speechless. I realized that Janet wasn't just speaking for herself and Mike. She'd said we've been talking as a family, which meant my other children, David and Sarah, were also part of this conversation about my apparently problematic neediness. How long? I asked quietly. How long have you all been discussing this behind my back? How long have you been seeing my attempts to be a loving mother and grandmother as burdens you needed to manage? Another pause, shorter this time, before Janet responded with what sounded like irritation at having to explain herself. Eleanor, this isn't about you being loving. This is about you being unable to accept that we're adults with our own lives. You call Michael at work to tell him about your doctor's appointments. You text Sarah constantly asking about her day, and getting upset when she doesn't respond within an hour. You invite yourself to David's house for dinner and then get hurt when they already have plans. These aren't normal expressions of love. They're signs that you need to develop your own life instead of trying to live vicariously through ours. I hung up the phone without saying goodbye, my hands trembling so violently I could barely place the receiver back in its cradle. I stood in my kitchen, surrounded by the evidence of my pathetic attempts to buy love and attention through constant giving, and felt something fundamental shift inside my chest. For the first time in my adult life, I saw myself clearly through other people's eyes, and the reflection was devastating. Was I really the needy, suffocating mother Janet had described? I walked slowly through my house, looking at it with new perspective. The refrigerator covered with photos of my children and grandchildren, most of which I'd taken and printed myself because I wanted to remember every moment. The spare bedrooms I kept perpetually ready for visits that happened less and less frequent. The craft room where I spent hours making personalized gifts for birthdays and holidays. Gifts that were received politely but without the enthusiasm I'd hoped for. In my living room, I stopped in front of the photo albums that chronicled decades of family gatherings, most of which I'd organized, planned, and paid for. Birthday parties where I'd gone overboard with decorations and gifts. Holiday celebrations where I'd cooked for days to create perfect meals. Vacation trips I'd funded so we could all spend time together. Looking at these memories now, I wondered if my family had attended out of obligation rather than joy, if my constant orchestration of togetherness had actually driven them away rather than bringing us closer. The doorbell rang, interrupting my painful self-reflection. Through the front window I could see my neighbor Helen approaching with a concerned expression on her face. Helen was roughly my age, a widow like myself, but unlike me, she'd managed to build a rich, independent life after her husband's death. She volunteered at the local animal shelter, traveled with groups of women her age, and maintained friendships that seemed effortless and reciprocal rather than desperate and one-sided like my relationships with my children. Eleanor, Helen said when I opened the door. I heard raised voices earlier and wanted to make sure you're all right. You look upset. I realized that my conversation with Janet had been loud enough for Helen to hear through our shared kitchen wall, which meant my humiliation was now public knowledge. The thought of having to explain that my own family found me too needy for attention made fresh tears spring to my eyes. I'm fine, I lied, stepping back to let her in. Just a family discussion that got a bit heated. Helen studied my face with the sharp intelligence that had made her a successful nurse before her retirement. Eleanor, she said gently, you don't look fine. You look like someone just told you that everything you believed about yourself was wrong. Her perceptiveness broke through the last of my composure, and I found myself telling her everything. About Janet's phone call, about my family's apparent consensus that I was too needy and demanding, about my growing realization that my attempts to be a loving mother had somehow transformed me into an emotional burden they needed to manage rather than a person they wanted to spend time with. Helen listened without interruption, her expression growing more troubled as my story unfolded. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment, staring out my kitchen window at the bird feeder where several cardinals were now gathered. Eleanor, she said finally, preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. How often do your children call you just to see how you're doing? Not to ask for help or tell you about their problems, but simply because they enjoy talking to you and want to know about your life. I opened my mouth to answer and realized I couldn't remember the last time any of my children had called me without wanting something. Every conversation was either initiated by me or prompted by their need for babysitting, financial help, advice about some crisis, or assistance with some practical matter. When was the last time one of them asked about your interests, your hobbies, your feelings about something unrelated to their lives? Helen continued. Again, I found myself speechless. My children knew the basic facts about my life, my health, my daily routine, but I couldn't recall any of them ever asking about my thoughts on current events, my opinions about books I was reading, or my feelings about anything that didn't directly affect them. Eleanor, Helen said gently, I don't think you're too needy for attention. I think you've been giving so much attention to people who don't reciprocate that you've forgotten what a balanced relationship looks like. When someone calls you needy for wanting basic acknowledgement and interest in your life, that says more about them than it does about you. Her words planted a seed of doubt about the narrative my family had constructed. Maybe I wasn't the problem. Maybe the problem was that I'd spent so many years training my children to see me as a resource rather than a person that they'd lost the ability to relate to me as anything else. That evening, I did something I hadn't done in years. Instead of calling each of my children to check in and ask about their days, I sat down with a cup of tea and really examined my relationships with them. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through months of text messages, looking for patterns I'd been too close to see. The evidence was overwhelming and heartbreaking. Page after page of messages from me asking about their lives, their children, their problems, their needs, offers of help, expressions of concern, attempts to initiate conversations about everything from their work stress to their weekend plan. And their responses, when they came at all, were brief, functional, focused on practical matters rather than emotional connection. Michael's messages were almost entirely logistic informations about babysitting schedules, requests for financial help with unexpected expenses, brief updates about the grandchildren when I specifically asked. There was no warmth, no curiosity about my life, no sense that he saw our relationship as anything more than a convenient support system. Sarah's texts were slightly warmer but equally one-sided. She shared problems and asked for advice, but never followed up to let me know how situations resolved. She accepted my offers of help with apparent gratitude, but never offered help in return, never asked if I needed anything, never seemed to consider that I might have my own struggles or concerns. David's communication was the most painful to review. Months would go by with nothing but my attempts to reach out, followed by brief, almost annoyed responses when I finally called or texted enough times to get his attention. He treated my desire to maintain contact as an inconvenience rather than a natural expression of maternal love. As I sat there, surrounded by evidence of my one-sided relationships with my own children, I felt something I'd never experienced before, genuine anger at their selfishness. For decades, I'd made excuses for their behavior, told myself they were busy with their own lives, convinced myself that my role as their mother meant always giving and never expecting anything in return. But looking at the stark reality of our interactions, I realized I'd raised 3 people who saw me as existing solely for their benefit. The phone rang again around 9 o'clock. This time it was Sarah, my youngest daughter, and for a moment I felt a flutter of hope that perhaps she was calling to check on me after hearing about my conversation with Janet. Maybe my family had reconsidered their harsh assessment of my neediness and realized they'd been unfair. Mom, Sarah said, without preamble, Janet told me about your conversation today, and I wanted to call and support what she said. We're all concerned about your increasing demands for attention and validation. It's becoming unhealthy for everyone involved. The hope that had flickered in my chest died instantly. Sarah wasn't calling to comfort me or apologize for her family's hurtful assessment. She was calling to pile on, to make sure I understood that their judgment was unanimous. Sarah, I said, my voice steadier than I'd expected, When was the last time you asked me how I was feeling about something that had nothing to do with you or your family? What do you mean? She asked, clearly caught off guard by the question. I mean, when was the last time you called me just because you missed me and wanted to hear my voice? When was the last time you asked about my day, my thoughts, my experiences, my feelings about anything unrelated to your immediate needs? Mom, you're being dramatic. We talk all the time. No, Sarah, I talk all the time. I ask about your life, your problems, your children, your work, your marriage. You respond when it's convenient and ignore me when it's not. That's not conversation. That's me providing free emotional labor while you take what you need and give nothing back. I could hear the shock in her voice when she responded. Mom, I don't know where this is coming from, but you're being really unfair. We're just asking for some boundaries, some space to live our own lives, without constantly managing your emotional needs. There was that word again, manage, as if my desire to be part of my children's lives was a burden they had to manage rather than a gift they should treasure, as if my love was something that required careful handling rather than something to be celebrated and reciprocated. Sarah, I said quietly, I think I'm beginning to understand something important. You're right that I need to redirect my attention and energy toward people who appreciate it, starting right now. I hung up before she could respond and turned off my phone. For the first time in years, I spent an evening without making my rounds of check-in calls, without sending goodnight texts, without worrying about whether my children needed anything from me. Instead, I sat in my living room and thought about what Helen had said about balanced relationships. I realized I couldn't remember the last time I'd felt genuinely valued by my children rather than simply useful. I couldn't remember the last time any of them had seemed interested in me as a person, rather than grateful for my services as a mother. I'd spent so many years defining myself through their needs, that I'd forgotten I had value beyond what I could provide for them. The next morning brought an unexpected clarity. I woke up without the usual knot of anxiety in my stomach about whether my children were okay, whether they needed anything from me, whether I'd somehow failed them in my role as their mother. Instead, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, curiosity about my own day, my own needs, my own desires. I made breakfast for myself without preparing extra portions for family members who might drop. I read the newspaper from cover to cover instead of skimming it quickly before starting my daily round of care package preparation. I called Helen and asked if she wanted to join me for coffee, not because I needed to discuss a family crisis, but because I enjoyed her company and wanted to learn more about her life. Over coffee at the local cafe, Helen told me about her volunteer work at the animal shelter, her book club, her weekend trips with a group of women she'd met through a hiking club. Her life was full of activities and relationships that had nothing to do with managing other people's needs, or trying to earn love through constant giving. You could have a life like this too, she said when I expressed admiration for her independence. You could find activities you enjoy, make friends who appreciate you for who you are rather than what you can do for them, create a life that doesn't revolve around other people's problems and needs. The idea was both terrifying and exhilarating. I'd spent so many decades defining myself as a mother, wife, and caregiver that I wasn't sure who Eleanor Hartwell was, beyond those roles, but looking at Helen's contented face, seeing the genuine joy she took in her independent life, I realized I wanted to find out. When I returned home, there were 6 missed calls on my phone, 3 from Michael, 2 from Sarah, and 1 from David. For the first time in my adult life, I didn't immediately call them back. Instead, I sat down with a notepad and made a list of things I'd always wanted to do but had never pursued because I'd been too busy taking care of everyone else. Travel to Europe, something I'd dreamed about since college, but had never prioritized because family needs always came first. Take art classes, a passion I'd abandoned when I got married and had children. Learn to speak Italian, a goal I'd mentioned casually for years but never acted upon. Volunteer for causes I cared about rather than just writing checks when my children asked me to support their various fundraising efforts. The list grew longer as I remembered interests and dreams I'd set aside in service of my family's needs. I'd been so focused on being available for their emergencies, their celebrations, their daily dramas that I'd forgotten I had the right to pursue my own interests and create my own adventures. My phone rang again. This time it was Michael, and his voice carried an edge of irritation that confirmed everything Janet had said about their perception of my neediness. "Mom, you didn't return my calls. Is everything okay?" "Everything's fine," I replied calmly. "I was busy with my own activities today." "Your own activities?" He sounded genuinely surprised, as if the concept of me having a life independent of their needs was foreign to him. "Yes, Michael, I had coffee with a friend, ran some errands, spent time thinking about some goals I'd like to pursue." Normal activities that adults engage in when they're not constantly monitoring other people's lives. "Mom, you sound different. Are you upset about something?" I realized that he genuinely couldn't understand why I might be upset about being told I was too needy for wanting basic acknowledgement and reciprocal interest in our relationship. In his mind, I existed primarily to provide support and assistance, and my desire for anything beyond that functional role was unreasonable. "Michael," I said carefully, "when was the last time you called me just because you missed me and wanted to talk? Not because you needed babysitting or help with something, but simply because you enjoyed our conversations and were curious about my life." There was a long pause. "Mom, I don't understand why you're asking these questions. You know I love you, I know you love me, but do you like me? Do you find me interesting as a person? Or do you just appreciate the services I provide as your mother?" Another pause. Longer this time. I could almost hear him struggling to understand why this distinction mattered, why I would need anything beyond the knowledge that I was loved in the abstract. "Mom, I think you might be overthinking things. Maybe you should talk to someone about these feelings you're having." The suggestion that my desire for reciprocal relationships indicated mental health problems rather than legitimate emotional needs was the final confirmation I needed. My children had become so accustomed to one-sided relationships with me that they couldn't conceive of treating me as an equal partner in a balanced exchange of care and interest. "Michael," I said quietly, "I think Janet was right about one thing. I do need to redirect my attention and energy toward people who appreciate it. I'm going to start doing that immediately." "What does that mean?" "It means I'm going to stop calling you every day to check in. I'm going to stop dropping everything when you have problems you want to discuss. I'm going to stop making myself constantly available for your convenience and start building relationships with people who are interested in me as a person, rather than grateful for my services as a caregiver." "Mom, you're being dramatic. We just asked for some boundary." "No, Michael. You told me I was too needy for wanting normal expressions of care and interest from my own family. You made it clear that my emotional needs are burdens you have to manage, rather than natural parts of a loving relationship. So I'm taking your advice and finding people who don't see caring about each other as a management problem." I hung up and turned off my phone again, feeling lighter with each boundary I established. For the first time in my adult life, I was prioritizing my own emotional well-being over my family's comfort with the status quo. That afternoon, I drove to the community center and signed up for an Italian language class that started the following week. I registered for a watercolor painting workshop and put my name on the waiting list for a book club that met monthly to discuss contemporary fiction. I walked through the volunteer fair and signed up to help at the literacy center, teaching adults to read instead of just writing checks to support the cause. Each decision felt like reclaiming a piece of myself I'd given away years ago. Each choice to pursue my own interests instead of monitoring my family's needs felt like an act of rebellion against the role they'd assigned me as their emotional support system rather than their equal. When I arrived home, there was a car in my driveway I didn't recognize. Through the front window, I could see two figures sitting in my living room, and I realized with a sinking heart that my children had apparently decided to stage an intervention about my newfound independence. I walked into my house to find Sarah and David waiting for me, their expressions a mixture of concern and frustration that made it clear they saw my behavior as problematic rather than healthy. "Mom," Sarah said before I could even set down my purse, "we need to talk about what's happening with you. Michael told us about your conversation today, and we're worried about these sudden changes in your behavior." I looked at my two youngest children, noting how they'd made themselves comfortable in my living room, helping themselves to the snacks I kept available for impromptu visits, clearly expecting me to drop everything and focus on their concerns about my life choices. What changes concern you? I asked, settling into my own chair instead of bustling around to make them more comfortable as I normally would have done. David leaned forward, his expression serious. Mom, this whole thing about redirecting your attention and energy away from family is really concerning. Family should be the priority, and it feels like you're having some kind of crisis that's making you want to abandon the people who love you most. The assumption that prioritizing my own interests meant abandoning my family revealed how completely they'd misunderstood what healthy relationships looked like. In their minds, any attention I gave to my own needs was attention stolen from them. Any energy I spent on my own goals was energy they were entitled to receive. I'm not abandoning anyone, I said calmly. I'm simply creating some balance in relationships that have become completely one-sided. I'm pursuing interests and friendships that don't revolve around other people's needs and problems. Sarah's face flushed with what looked like genuine hurt. Mom, we're not just other people, we're your children. Caring about us isn't supposed to be balanced like some kind of business transaction. You're supposed to love us unconditionally and want to be involved in our lives. The word unconditionally struck me as particularly revealing. In Sarah's understanding, my love was supposed to be unconditional while theirs was apparently contingent on my continuing to fulfill my role as their support system without asking for anything in return. Sarah, I love you unconditionally, but that doesn't mean I have to accept being treated as if my only value lies in what I can provide for you. Unconditional love doesn't mean unlimited access to someone's time, energy, and emotional resources without reciprocation. David stood up abruptly, his frustration boiling over. Mom, this is ridiculous. You're acting like we don't appreciate everything you do for us, but we do. We just need some space to live our own lives without feeling guilty every time we don't call you back immediately or include you in every decision. The fact that they experienced guilt when they ignored me told me they knew their behavior was wrong, but instead of changing their behavior, they wanted me to stop expecting better treatment, so they could continue taking me for granted without feeling bad about it. David, when was the last time you did something thoughtful for me? When was the last time you asked about my day, my feelings, my interests, my goals? When was the last time you offered to help me with anything, or showed curiosity about my life beyond its impact on yours? He stared at me as if I'd asked him to solve a complex mathematical equation. The fact that he couldn't immediately answer such basic questions about reciprocal care and our relationship proved everything I'd begun to understand about how they saw me. I do things for you, he said defensively. I call you for Mother's Day and your birthday. I visit during holidays. Those are obligatory gestures, David. I'm talking about spontaneous expressions of care and interest. I'm talking about the kind of attention and consideration you show to your friends, your colleagues, your neighbor. When was the last time you treated me like someone whose thoughts and feelings mattered to you? Sarah and David exchanged glances that confirmed they'd coordinated this visit to pressure me back into my previous role as their emotional support system. The fact that they saw my desire for balanced relationships as a problem to be solved rather than a legitimate need to be respected told me everything I needed to know about their true feelings toward me. Look, Mom, Sarah said in a tone that suggested she was trying to be patient with an unreasonable child. Maybe you should talk to someone about these feelings you're having. Maybe there's something going on with your hormones or your mental health that's making you feel like we don't appreciate you enough. The suggestion that my legitimate complaints about one-sided relationships were symptoms of mental or physical illness rather than reasonable responses to being taken for granted was so insulting that I felt my composure finally crack. Sarah, I said, my voice sharper than I'd intended, there is nothing wrong with my mental health. There is nothing wrong with wanting reciprocal relationships with my own children. There is nothing wrong with expecting the people I love to show some interest in my life beyond what I can do for them. The problem isn't that I'm having a crisis. The problem is that you've all become so accustomed to taking me for granted that you can't imagine treating me like a person whose needs and feelings matter. Both of my children looked genuinely shocked by my response, as if they'd never considered that I might have legitimate grievances about how they treated me. Their surprise confirmed that they'd truly seen me as existing primarily for their benefit rather than as a complete person with my own emotional needs and desires. David's phone buzzed with a text message, and he glanced at it with obvious relief at the interruption. Mom, I have to go. Lisa needs me to pick up the kids from soccer practice, but I think we should continue this conversation soon. Maybe with Michael and Janet there too, so we can all work together to figure out what's best for everyone. The casual way he prioritized his wife's request over our serious conversation about our relationship, combined with his suggestion that my family needed to collectively decide what was best for everyone regarding my emotional needs, crystallized everything that was wrong with our dynamic. I wasn't an equal participant in these relationships. I was someone whose needs and feelings were subject to family committee review. After they left, I sat in my living room feeling emotionally drained but also strangely empowered. For the first time in my adult life, I'd articulated my needs clearly and refused to accept dismissive responses. I'd set boundaries and maintained them despite pressure to return to my previous role as their unconditional support system. I walked to my kitchen and looked at the care packages I'd prepared earlier in the week. Packages that now seemed like pathetic attempts to buy love from people who saw my generosity as evidence of my neediness rather than expressions of genuine care. I picked up the packages and after a moment's hesitation put them in my car to donate to the homeless shelter downtown. As I drove through my neighborhood toward the shelter, I realized I was driving past lives I'd never really noticed because I'd been so focused on managing my family's needs. There was Mrs. Patterson from 3 streets over, working in her garden with obvious joy and concentration. There was the young father from the corner house, teaching his toddler to ride a tricycle with patience and delight. There was the elderly couple who walked hand in hand every evening, clearly enjoying each other's company after decades of marriage. All around me were examples of people living full independent lives, people who weren't defining themselves entirely through their usefulness to others, people who seemed to have figured out how to balance caring for others with caring for themselves. I'd been so consumed with my role as the family caretaker that I'd forgotten there were other ways to find meaning and connection. At the homeless shelter, the volunteer coordinator accepted my care packages with genuine gratitude and asked if I'd be interested in helping with their weekly meal service. For the first time in months, someone was asking for my help because they valued what I could contribute, not because they'd grown accustomed to taking my assistance for granted. I signed up for the next meal service and drove home feeling like I'd taken the first real step toward building the kind of life Helen had described, a life where my energy and attention were appreciated rather than expected, where my care was reciprocated rather than simply consumed. That evening, I turned my phone back on to find 17 missed calls and dozens of text messages from my children, all expressing various degrees of concern, frustration, and what seemed like genuine panic at my unavailability. Reading through their messages, I was struck by how differently they responded to my temporary absence compared to how I'd always responded to theirs. When they didn't return my calls for days, I made excuses for their busy lives and convinced myself their silence didn't reflect their feelings about me. But when I was unreachable for a few hours, they immediately assumed something was wrong and demanded explanations for my behavior. The double standard was staggering and confirmed that they'd never learned to respect my independence or trust my judgment about my own life. Michael's messages started concerned and grew increasingly irritated as the day progressed. The progression from "Mom, are you okay?" to "Mom, you need to call me back immediately" to "Mom, this is ridiculous behavior," showed how quickly his worry transformed into anger when I didn't immediately respond to his demands for my attention. Sarah's texts were more emotional but equally self-centered. She'd sent long messages about how worried she was, how unlike me this behavior seemed, how much she needed to know I was safe. But nowhere in her flood of concerned messages was there any acknowledgement that I might need space to process our conversation, or that I had the right to be unavailable without providing detailed explanations. David's messages were the most revealing. After a few perfunctory expressions of concern, he'd moved on to practical matters, asking if I could still babysit his children the following weekend and whether I'd heard back from the insurance company about his car accident claim. Even in the middle of what he characterized as a family crisis about my mental state, he was still thinking primarily about what he needed from me. I realized that their panic about my temporary unavailability wasn't really about concern for my well-being. It was about anxiety over the potential disruption to the support system I provided. They weren't worried about me as a person. They were worried about losing access to their reliable source of emotional labor, practical help, and financial assistance. The insight was both painful and liberating. Painful because it confirmed that my children's love for me was deeply intertwined with their dependence on my services. Liberating because it freed me from the guilt I'd felt about pursuing my own interests and setting boundaries around their demands for my constant availability. I spent the weekend doing something I hadn't done in decades, living entirely for myself. I slept in without feeling guilty about not making breakfast for family members who might drop by. I read books without interruption, worked in my garden at my own pace, and took long walks through my neighborhood without my phone in case someone needed me. For the first time in my adult life, I experienced what it felt like to have a weekend that belonged entirely to me, free from the constant background anxiety about whether my children were okay and whether there was something I should be doing to help them with their lives. The peace was intoxicating and made me realize how much stress I'd been carrying without even recognizing it. Sunday evening brought an unexpected visit. I was reading on my back porch when I heard footsteps on my front walkway, and I looked up to see Janet approaching with an expression that suggested she was bracing herself for an unpleasant conversation. "Eleanor," she said when I opened the door, "we need to talk about what's been happening this week. Your children are worried about you, and frankly so am I. This sudden change in your behavior is concerning to everyone who cares about you." I invited her in and offered coffee, noting how she positioned herself across from me with the kind of body language that suggested she saw this as a negotiation rather than a conversation between family members. "Janet," I said once we were settled, "what exactly concerns you about my behavior this week?" She pulled out her phone and began reading from what appeared to be a prepared list. "You haven't returned phone calls promptly. You've been unreachable for hours at a time without explanation. You've told your children you're redirecting your attention away from family toward other people. You've signed up for activities without discussing them with anyone. You've refused to commit to babysitting schedules that families are depending." Each item on her list was presented as evidence of problematic behavior, but listening to her recite them, I realized they were actually descriptions of normal adult independence. The fact that my family saw these basic expressions of autonomy as concerning revealed how completely they'd grown accustomed to controlling my time and attention. "Janet," I said calmly, "everything you've described is normal behavior for an independent adult. The fact that you see these things as problems suggests that your expectations about my availability and accessibility have become unreasonable." Her expression hardened slightly. "Eleanor, we're not being unreasonable. We're concerned about someone we love who seems to be having some kind of emotional crisis that's affecting her relationships with the people closest to her." Janet's attempt to frame my independence as an emotional crisis was so transparent that I almost laughed. Instead, I looked directly at her and asked a question that clearly caught her off guard. "Janet, in the 3 years you've been married to my son, how many times have you asked me about my interests, my goals, my thoughts about anything unrelated to your immediate family needs?" She blinked several times, clearly unprepared for the question. "Eleanor, I don't understand what you're getting at. I'm asking whether you've ever shown any curiosity about me as a person rather than appreciated me as a service provider. Have you ever asked about my hobbies, my opinions, my experiences, my feelings about topics that don't directly affect your household?" Janet shifted uncomfortably in her chair. "We talk all the time, Eleanor. You know we care about you. We don't talk, Jan. You inform me about your needs, and I respond to them. You accept my help and I provide it. You tell me about your problems and I offer solutions. But when have you ever asked about my day, my thoughts, my experiences, my challenges? When have you ever offered to help me with anything?" The silence stretched between us as Janet struggled to find an example of reciprocal interest in our relationship. Her inability to answer confirmed what I'd suspected. She, like my children, had never seen me as someone whose inner life might be worth exploring or whose needs might deserve consideration. "Eleanor," she said finally, her voice taking on a patronizing tone that made my skin crawl, "I think you're creating problems where none exist. You're a mother and grandmother. Your role is to support and nurture your family. That's what gives your life meaning and purpose. These feelings you're having about needing attention and validation are just signs that you need to find more fulfillment in your natural role rather than seeking validation from inappropriate sources." The casual dismissal of my emotional needs as inappropriate, combined with her reduction of my entire identity to my reproductive and caregiving functions, crystallized everything that was wrong with how my family viewed me. In Janet's understanding, I wasn't a complete person with legitimate needs for reciprocal relationships. I was a mother-shaped service provider, whose value lay entirely in what I could do for others. Janet, I said, my voice steadier than I felt, I am a person who happens to be a mother and grandmother. Those are important parts of my identity, but they're not the totality of who I am. I have interests, opinions, experiences, and needs that exist independently of my family relationship. The fact that you can't conceive of me as a whole person whose emotional needs deserve consideration tells me everything I need to know about why this conversation is necessary. Her face flushed with what appeared to be genuine anger. Eleanor, you're being selfish and unreasonable. Your family loves you and depends on you. This sudden decision to withdraw your support and attention because you're not getting enough praise and acknowledgement is manipulative and hurtful. The accusation of manipulation was particularly galling because it inverted the reality of our situation. I had been manipulated for years into believing that my value lay entirely in my usefulness to others, that wanting reciprocal care and interest was selfish, that my role as a mother meant unlimited availability without expectation of equal consideration. Janet's anger at my refusal to continue accepting this arrangement revealed how invested she was in maintaining a system that benefited her at my expense. Janet, I'm not withdrawing support and attention because I want praise. I'm establishing boundaries because I refuse to continue relationships where my only value lies in what I can provide for other people. I'm creating space for relationships where care and interest flow in both directions, where my thoughts and feelings matter as much as everyone else. She stood up abruptly, her professional composure finally cracking completely. Eleanor, I came here hoping we could resolve this situation reasonably, but it's clear you're determined to damage your relationships with the people who love you most. I hope you'll reconsider before you push your family away permanently. The threat was unmistakable. In Janet's mind, my insistence on being treated as an equal participant in family relationships was damage that needed to be repaired. My refusal to continue accepting a subordinate role where my needs were secondary to everyone else's was seen as an act of aggression against the family structure, rather than a reasonable demand for basic respect. After she left, I sat in my living room, feeling exhausted but also oddly exhilarated. For the first time in my adult life, I'd refused to accept responsibility for managing other people's discomfort with my legitimate emotional needs. I'd stated my position clearly, and maintained it despite pressure to return to my previous role as the family's emotional support system. That evening, I received a phone call that surprised me. It was my older sister Margaret, who lived across the country, and with whom I'd maintained only sporadic contact over the year. Our conversations had always been brief and superficial, focused on family updates and holiday pleasantries, rather than meaningful personal connection. Eleanor, she said, her voice warm but concerned, I got a very strange phone call from Michael today. He said you were having some kind of emotional crisis and withdrawing from the family. He asked if I'd noticed any concerning changes in your behavior during our recent conversations. I told him we haven't had any recent conversations beyond Christmas cards, which seemed to surprise him. I felt a mixture of embarrassment and anger at learning that Michael had reached out to extended family members to discuss my supposed mental health crisis. The fact that he'd characterized my boundary setting as withdrawal and emotional instability, and that he'd done so without my knowledge or consent, felt like a violation of privacy that confirmed his lack of respect for my autonomy. Margaret, I said carefully, did Michael tell you specifically what behaviors he found concerning? He said you weren't returning phone calls promptly, that you'd become unreachable for hours at a time, and that you'd told the family you were redirecting your attention toward other people because you felt unappreciated. He seemed to think these were signs of depression or some kind of breakdown. Margaret paused, and when she continued, her voice carried a note of dry humor that reminded me why I'd always enjoyed her company during our childhood. Eleanor, she said, what Michael described sounds like normal adult behavior to me. In fact, it sounds healthier than what I remember about your relationship with your children over the years. The few times we've talked, I've always been struck by how much you do for them and how little they seem to do for you in return. Her observation, coming from someone with minimal investment in my family dynamics, carried weight precisely because of her outsider perspective. Margaret had no reason to flatter me or validate my complaints, which made her assessment feel particularly credible. Margaret, can I ask you something? When you talk to your children, what do those conversations look like? Well, she said thoughtfully, it varies depending on what's happening in our lives. Sometimes they call because they need advice or help with something. Sometimes I call because I want to hear about their jobs or relationships or just because I miss them. Sometimes we call each other just to share something funny or interesting that happened. It's pretty balanced, I'd say. We both make effort to maintain the relationship. The contrast between Margaret's description of balanced family relationships and my own experience was stark. In her family, care and interest flowed in both directions. Phone calls were initiated by both parties for various reasons, including simple affection and desire for connection. Both generations made effort to maintain relationships, rather than one side doing all the emotional labor. Eleanor, Margaret continued, how long has it been since one of your children called you just because they missed you or wanted to share something with you, not because they needed something? I realized I couldn't remember such a phone call ever happening. Every conversation with my children was either initiated by me or prompted by their need for practical help, emotional support, or problem-solving assistance. Margaret, I don't think that's ever happened. Every conversation is either me reaching out to check on them, or them contacting me because they need something. The silence that followed was profound. Margaret was processing the reality of relationships that had become so one-sided that my children had never learned to see me as someone worth contacting, simply for the pleasure of my company. Eleanor, she said finally, that's not normal. That's not healthy. And the fact that they're characterizing your desire for balanced relationships as an emotional crisis suggests they've become so accustomed to taking you for granted that they can't imagine treating you any differently. Her validation of my experience felt like a lifeline. For days I'd been questioning whether my expectations were reasonable, whether my hurt feelings were justified, whether my newfound boundaries were fair to my family. Having someone with no agenda confirm that my children's behavior was problematic rather than my response being unreasonable gave me strength to continue standing my ground. Margaret, what do you think I should do? I think you should continue doing exactly what you're doing. You're not abandoning your children or withdrawing your love. You're insisting on being treated with basic respect and consideration. If they can't handle that, the problem isn't with your expectation. The problem is with their sense of entitlement to your unlimited availability without reciprocation. We talked for another hour, and for the first time in months, I experienced what a balanced conversation felt like. Margaret asked about my interests, my daily life, my feelings about the situation with my children. She shared updates about her own life, her work, her struggles with aging parents, her thoughts about retirement. We laughed together, commiserated about shared challenges, and made plans to visit each other in the coming months. After we hung up, I realized how hungry I'd been for this kind of mutual exchange, how much I'd missed having conversations where I was seen as an interesting person with thoughts and experiences worth exploring, rather than just a resource to be consulted when problems arose. The next morning brought another confrontation, this time in the form of an unannounced visit from all three of my children together. I was working in my garden when I heard car doors slamming in my driveway, and I looked up to see Michael, Sarah, and David approaching with expressions that suggested they'd coordinated this intervention to present a united front. Mom, Michael said without preamble, we need to have a serious conversation about what's been happening this week. We're all concerned about your behavior, and we think you might benefit from talking to a professional about these feelings you're having. The immediate suggestion that my legitimate complaints required professional intervention rather than family acknowledgement was so insulting that I felt my carefully maintained composure begin to crack. I set down my gardening tools and looked at my three children, noting how they'd arranged themselves in what appeared to be a defensive formation, as if they expected me to attack them rather than engage in reasonable conversation. I'm happy to have a conversation, I said calmly, but first I want to establish something. Nothing I've said or done this week indicates mental health problems. Wanting reciprocal relationships with my children is normal. Expecting basic courtesy and consideration from the people I love is reasonable. Setting boundaries around my time and availability is healthy. If you've come here to convince me that these expectations are symptoms of illness, this conversation is over before it starts. Sarah stepped forward, her expression a mixture of hurt and frustration. Mom, we're not saying you're mentally ill, we're saying your behavior has changed dramatically, and we're worried about you. The things you're saying about our relationship don't match our experience of loving and appreciating you. Her characterization of our relationships as loving and appreciative despite all evidence to the contrary suggested either genuine delusion or deliberate manipulation. I decided to test which it was, by asking specific questions about their behavior. Sarah, when was the last time you called me just to hear my voice? Not because you needed advice or help with something. She opened her mouth to answer, then closed it, clearly struggling to recall such an instant. When was the last time you asked about my day, my thoughts, my feelings about something unrelated to your immediate needs? Another pause, longer this time. When was the last time you offered to help me with anything or showed interest in my goals and dreams? By this point, Sarah's face was flushed with what I hoped was shame rather than anger, but I couldn't be sure. David jumped in, clearly trying to rescue his sister from the uncomfortable questioning. Mom, you're being unfair. We show love in different ways. We don't need to call you every day or ask about your feelings to prove we care about you. His dismissal of my need for regular contact and emotional connection as proof of caring revealed how little he understood about maintaining relationships. In his mind, love was a static state that didn't require ongoing expression or nurturing, rather than a dynamic exchange that needed to be actively maintained by both parties. David, how do you show love to your friends? How do you maintain relationships with people you care about who aren't family members? He looked confused by the question, as if the idea of treating family members with the same consideration he showed to friends was foreign to him. I mean, I check in with them, ask how they're doing, make plans to spend time together, listen when they have problems, celebrate their successes, normal friendship stuff. Exactly, I said. And when was the last time you did any of those things with me? When was the last time you checked in to see how I was doing, made plans to spend time together, because you enjoyed my company, listened to my problems, or celebrated my successes? The silence that followed was profound. All three of my children were staring at me as if I'd asked them to solve an impossible puzzle, as if the concept of treating me with the same courtesy they showed to their friends was incomprehensible. Michael finally broke the silence, his voice carrying an edge of irritation that suggested he saw my questions as attacks, rather than legitimate inquiries about the nature of our relationships. Mom, you're our mother. The relationship dynamic is different. You're supposed to be there for us unconditionally. That's what parents do. We don't need to reciprocate in the same way, because we didn't choose to bring you into the world. You chose to bring us into the world, which means you chose the responsibility of caring for. His statement was so breathtakingly selfish that I felt physically sick. In Michael's understanding, my decision to have children had obligated me to provide unlimited care and support for the rest of my life, without expecting anything in return. He saw our parent-child relationship as a one-way contract where I was permanently indebted to him for the privilege of being his mother. Michael, I said quietly, you're 34 years old. You've been an adult for 16 years. The idea that I owe you unlimited support and attention because I chose to have children is not only selfish, it's emotionally abusive. Adult relationships, even between parents and children, require mutual care and consideration. The fact that you can't understand that suggests I failed you in some fundamental way as a parent. His face reddened with what appeared to be genuine anger at being called selfish and emotionally abusive, but he didn't deny the accuracy of my characterization of his expectation. Mom, you're being ridiculous. Every parent in the world understands that their role is to support their children throughout their lives. That's what family means. This sudden demand for reciprocal treatment is bizarre and honestly a little concerning. The casual dismissal of my need for balanced relationships as bizarre and concerning, combined with his insistence that parenthood created lifetime obligations that ran only in one direction, confirmed that Michael had never learned to see me as a complete person, whose needs mattered as much as his own. Sarah and David nodded their agreement with Michael's assessment, creating a united front that made it clear they shared his sense of entitlement to my unlimited care without reciprocation. The three of them stood in my garden, people I'd loved and sacrificed for their entire lives, telling me that my desire to be treated with basic human consideration was unreasonable and potentially pathological. I looked at my children and realized that I was seeing them clearly for the first time in their adult lives. They weren't just thoughtless or busy or overwhelmed with their own responsibility. They were fundamentally selfish people who had never learned to value relationships based on mutual care and respect because I had trained them to see me as existing solely for their benefit. The insight was devastating but also liberating. I had spent years making excuses for their behavior, convincing myself that their self-centeredness was temporary or circumstantial rather than fundamental to their character. But listening to them dismiss my emotional needs as inappropriate while defending their right to unlimited access to my time and energy without reciprocation, I realized that these weren't good people who had developed bad habits. These were selfish people who had been enabled to become even more selfish by my unwillingness to set boundaries. I'm going to ask all three of you to leave now, I said calmly. I need time to think about what you've told me today, and I need space to decide how I want to move forward with our relationships. Mom, you can't just kick us out because you don't like what we're saying, Sarah protested. We're trying to help you understand why your behavior is concerning to people who love you. I'm not kicking you out because I don't like what you're saying. I'm asking you to leave because you've made it clear that you see my desire for balanced relationships as a problem to be solved rather than a legitimate need to be respected. I need time to process the fact that my own children think I'm unreasonable for wanting the same consideration they show to their friends. After they left, I sat in my garden for a long time, surrounded by the roses and vegetables I'd tended for decades, trying to absorb the full implications of what had just happened. My children hadn't come to apologize for taking me for granted or to discuss how we might create more balanced relationships. They'd come to convince me that my expectations were unreasonable and my emotional needs were symptoms of mental instability. The realization that they genuinely believed I was being selfish and concerning rather than simply asking for basic respect was both heartbreaking and clarifying. It meant that the problem with our relationships wasn't miscommunication or misunderstanding. The problem was a fundamental difference in how we viewed my value and worth as a person. That afternoon, I called Helen and asked if she wanted to join me for dinner. When she arrived, she took one look at my face and immediately asked what had happened. I told her about the intervention my children had staged, about their insistence that my desire for reciprocal relationships was bizarre and concerning, about Michael's statement that parenthood had obligated me to provide unlimited support without expecting anything in return. Helen listened without interruption, her expression growing more troubled as my story unfolded. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment, staring out my kitchen window at the bird feeder where several finches were competing for seeds. "Eleanor," she said finally, "I want you to understand something important. What your children did today wasn't an intervention motivated by love and concern. It was an attempt to manipulate you back into a role that serves their needs at the expense of your well-being. The fact that they're characterizing your reasonable expectations as mental health problems is a form of gaslighting designed to make you question your own perceptions and return to accepting unacceptable treatment." Her use of the term gaslighting surprised me. I'd heard the word but hadn't considered that it might apply to my situation. The idea that my own children might be deliberately trying to undermine my confidence in my own judgment was almost too painful to consider. "Helen, do you really think they're doing it deliberately, or do you think they genuinely believe what they're saying? I think they've become so accustomed to benefiting from your unlimited availability and support that they can't imagine any other arrangement. Whether that's deliberate manipulation or genuine entitlement doesn't really matter. The effect is the same. They're trying to convince you that your needs don't matter so they can continue taking advantage of your generosity." We spent the evening cooking dinner together, and I was struck by how different it felt to share a meal with someone who treated me as an equal partner in the conversation. Helen asked about my interests, shared stories from her own life, listened with genuine attention when I talked about my feelings regarding the situation with my children. The contrast between this balanced interaction and my typical family dinners where I did most of the listening and supporting while receiving little interest in return was stark. Over the following days, I threw myself into the activities I'd signed up for at the community center. The Italian language class was challenging but exhilarating, awakening a part of my brain that had been dormant for years. The watercolor painting workshop allowed me to explore creative impulses I'd suppressed in service of my family's more practical needs. The volunteer work at the literacy center connected me with people who appreciated my help without taking it for granted. Each new activity reinforced the lesson I'd been learning. There were people in the world who valued my company, my skills, my perspective, and my contributions without seeing me as existing solely to meet their needs. The other students in my classes were interested in getting to know me as a person. The staff at the literacy center treated me as a valued volunteer whose time and effort were gifts rather than obligations. The adult learners I worked with showed genuine gratitude for my help while also sharing their own stories and experiences. For the first time in decades, I was experiencing what it felt like to be valued for who I was, rather than what I could provide for other people. The contrast with my family relationships was so stark that I began to understand how severely I'd been undervaluing myself by accepting their treatment as normal. Meanwhile, my phone continued to ring with calls from my children, but the tone of their messages had shifted from concern to frustration to what sounded increasingly like anger. They'd apparently expected my boundaries to be temporary, a phase I would pass through before returning to my previous role as their emotional support system. My continued unavailability and pursuit of independent activities seemed to be provoking genuine panic about the potential permanent disruption of the services I provided. Michael's messages had become particularly demanding. He'd left several voicemails expressing frustration that I wasn't available for scheduled babysitting duties and wasn't responding to family requests for help with various problems. His tone suggested that he saw my unavailability as a deliberate attempt to punish the family rather than a natural result of my newfound engagement with my own life. Sarah's messages were more emotional but equally self-centered. She'd sent long texts about how hurt she was by my withdrawal, how much she missed our relationship, how confused she was by my sudden change in behavior, but notably absent from her expressions of hurt were any acknowledgments of how her treatment of me might have contributed to the situation or any offers to modify her behavior to create more balanced relationships. David's communications were the most revealing because they focused almost entirely on practical matters. He'd sent texts asking about insurance paperwork he needed help with, requests for financial assistance with unexpected expenses, and questions about holiday plans he assumed I would organize and fund as usual. His apparent inability to recognize that our family crisis might affect his access to my practical support suggested a level of self-centeredness that was almost pathological. Reading through their messages, I was struck by how none of them had asked what they could do to improve our relationships or acknowledged that their treatment of me might have been problematic. They were all focused on convincing me to return to my previous role rather than examining whether that role had been fair or sustainable. The pattern confirmed everything I'd begun to understand about their fundamental selfishness. They weren't concerned about my happiness or well-being. They were concerned about maintaining access to my services. They didn't miss me as a person. They missed what I did for them. 2 weeks into my new routine, I received an unexpected phone call from someone I hadn't heard from in years. It was my former neighbor Alice, who had moved to Florida after her husband's retirement, but had remained in touch with mutual friends in our old neighborhood. "Eleanor," she said, her voice warm with genuine affection, "I hope you don't mind me calling out of the blue. I was talking to Helen yesterday, and she mentioned that you're going through some changes with your family situation. I wanted to reach out because I've been thinking about you a lot lately and wanted you to know that I remember how wonderful you were as a friend and neighbor." Her unexpected kindness brought tears to my eyes. Alice and I had been close when we lived near each other, sharing morning coffee, gardening tips, and long conversations about everything from books to current events to our hopes and fears. But after she moved, our friendship had gradually faded as I became increasingly consumed with managing my family's needs and problems. "Alice," I said, "it's so good to hear from you. I have to admit, I'm going through a difficult time with my children right now,
and I'm questioning a lot of things about my relationships and my priorities. Helen told me a little bit about what's happening, and I wanted to share something with you that might be helpful. After Jim and I moved to Florida, I went through a similar experience with my own children. Not exactly the same situation, but I had to learn some hard lessons about the difference between being a loving parent and being a doormat. Her willingness to share her own experiences with family boundary setting felt like another lifeline. For weeks I'd been questioning whether my response to my children's treatment was reasonable, or whether I was overreacting to normal family dynamics. Having another mother validate that boundary setting was sometimes necessary, gave me confidence to continue standing my ground.
What happened with your family? I asked.
Well, she said, after Jim and I moved, our daughter Linda began treating us like a branch office of the bank of mom and dad. She'd call with financial emergencies, relationship problems, career crises, childcare needs. We were so happy to feel needed and useful that we said yes to everything. But gradually I realized that Linda never called just to chat, never asked how we were adjusting to retirement, never showed any interest in our new life in Florida, unless it somehow related to her immediate needs. The parallel to my own situation was so exact that I felt a shock of recognition. Alice was describing the same pattern of one-sided relationships that had characterized my interactions with my children for years.
What did you do about it?
I started setting boundaries.
I told Linda that we were happy to help with genuine emergencies, but we weren't going to fund her lifestyle or provide on-demand emotional support without reciprocation. I explained that we wanted relationships with our children and grandchildren that included mutual interest and care, not just crisis management and financial assistance. How did she respond? At first, she reacted very much like your children seem to be reacting. She accused me of being selfish and unreasonable. She suggested that I was having some kind of midlife crisis that was affecting my judgment. She even called Jim to complain that I was becoming difficult and demanding. My heart sank at the familiar pattern. It seemed that children who had been enabled to take their parents for granted responded to boundary setting with remarkably similar tactics: accusations of selfishness, suggestions of mental instability, attempts to recruit other family members to pressure the boundary setter back into compliance. But Alice, how did it turn out? Are you still in contact with Linda? We are, but it took almost 2 years for her to adjust to the new dynamic. She had to learn that maintaining a relationship with us required effort on her part, that we were people with our own needs and interests rather than just resources for her to access when convenient. It was difficult for everyone involved, but ultimately our relationship became much healthier and more balanced. The hope in Alice's voice when she described her improved relationship with her daughter gave me courage to continue with my own boundary setting despite the immediate pain it was causing. The idea that my children might eventually learn to treat me with the respect and consideration I deserved was worth the temporary discomfort of their anger and manipulation. Alice, can I ask you something? Do you ever regret setting those boundaries? Do you ever wish you'd just continued accepting the one-sided relationship to avoid the conflict? Never, she said firmly. Eleanor, you can't build genuine relationships on the foundation of one person doing all the giving while the other person does all the taking. That's not love, that's exploitation. Setting boundaries wasn't about punishing Linda or withdrawing my love. It was about insisting on being treated with basic human dignity and respect. After we hung up, I felt more confident than I had since this whole situation began. Alice's experience proved that it was possible to transform dysfunctional family relationships through boundary setting, even when the initial response was anger and resistance. Her daughter had eventually learned to appreciate having a mother who valued herself enough to demand reciprocal treatment. That evening, I made a decision that felt both terrifying and liberating. I sat down at my computer and wrote individual emails to each of my children explaining clearly what I needed from our relationships going forward, and what I was no longer willing to accept. To Michael, I wrote about the importance of balanced communication, mutual support, and treating me as a person whose thoughts and feelings mattered as much as his own. I explained that I would no longer be available for constant crisis management and emergency babysitting unless he began showing genuine interest in my life and well-being. To Sarah, I wrote about the need for reciprocal emotional support, regular contact that wasn't motivated by immediate needs, and acknowledgement that I had a life and interests independent of her family's problem. I explained that I wanted to maintain our relationship but only if it involved mutual care and consideration. To David, I wrote about basic courtesy, regular communication, and the importance of treating family members with at least as much consideration as he showed to friends and colleagues. I explained that I would no longer provide financial assistance and practical support to someone who couldn't be bothered to maintain regular contact or show interest in my well-being. Each email was carefully crafted to express love while clearly establishing boundaries. I explained that I wasn't punishing them or withdrawing my love, but that I was insisting on relationships based on mutual respect rather than one-sided service. I gave them time to process my expectations, and invited them to contact me when they were ready to discuss how we might build healthier relationships together. After sending the emails, I felt a mixture of terror and relief. Terror because I was essentially giving my children an ultimatum that might result in the complete breakdown of our relationships. Relief because I had finally articulated my needs clearly and taken control of my own emotional well-being, rather than continuing to accept unacceptable treatment. The responses came faster than I'd expected, and they confirmed my worst fears about my children's character while also validating my decision to set boundaries. None of them expressed willingness to examine their own behavior or work toward more balanced relationships. Instead, they all focused on convincing me that my expectations were unreasonable, and my boundaries were evidence of mental instability. Michael's response arrived first, and it was everything I'd expected and worse. He dismissed my requests for balanced communication as unrealistic expectations that no adult child could meet. He characterized my need for mutual support as emotional neediness that suggested I required professional help. Most painfully, he explicitly stated that he saw our parent-child relationship as fundamentally different from other relationships, with built-in obligations that ran only from parent to child, never the reverse. His email concluded with an ultimatum of his own. Either I returned to my previous role as the family's support system, or he would be forced to limit my access to his children because my unstable behavior was creating an unhealthy environment for their development. The threat to restrict my relationship with my grandchildren was clearly calculated to force my compliance through emotional blackmail. Sarah's response was more emotionally manipulative, but equally unwilling to acknowledge any need for change on her part. She wrote long paragraphs about how hurt and confused she was by my sudden transformation from a loving mother into someone who demanded reciprocation for her care. She characterized my boundary setting as a betrayal of the unconditional love that defined motherhood, suggesting that my expectations revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of what family relationships should look like. Her email was filled with examples of ways she claimed to show love and appreciation, but every example involved accepting my help graciously rather than offering support in return. In her mind, being grateful for my services was equivalent to reciprocal care, and my failure to recognize her gratitude as sufficient proved I was becoming unreasonably demanding. David's response was the most revealing because it focused almost entirely on practical concern. He acknowledged that our communication had become one-sided but attributed this to his busy lifestyle rather than lack of consideration for my feelings. He expressed willingness to call more frequently if I would return to providing the financial and practical support his family had come to depend on. His transactional approach to our relationship confirmed that he saw me primarily as a resource rather than a person deserving of care and consideration. Reading their responses, I felt a mixture of grief and clarity. Grief because I was finally accepting that my children were not the people I'd hoped they would become, that decades of sacrificing my own needs to meet theirs had created fundamentally selfish adults who genuinely believed they were entitled to my unlimited care without reciprocation. Clarity because their unwillingness to even consider changing their behavior confirmed that my boundaries were necessary and appropriate. I didn't respond to their emails immediately. Instead, I spent the weekend engaged in activities that brought me joy and connection with people who valued my company. I attended my Italian class and discovered that I had a natural aptitude for languages that had been dormant for decades. I worked on a watercolor painting of my garden that captured the peace I felt when I was engaged in activities that fed my soul rather than depleted it. I volunteered at the literacy center and helped a woman my age learn to read well enough to understand her medication labels independently. Each activity reinforced the lesson I'd been learning about the difference between relationships based on mutual respect and relationships based on exploitation. The people I met through my new activities were interested in me as a person, curious about my thoughts and experiences, appreciative of my contributions without taking them for granted. They treated me the way I'd always treated my children, as someone whose company was valued, whose perspectives were interesting, whose well-being mattered. Monday morning brought an unexpected development. Helen called to tell me that she'd run into Janet at the grocery store and had been subjected to what sounded like a coordinated effort to recruit allies and pressuring me back into my previous role. "Eleanor," Helen said, her voice tight with anger. Janet approached me in the produce section and started a conversation about her concerns regarding your mental health. She suggested that your recent behavior changes might indicate early dementia or depression, and she asked if I'd noticed any concerning symptoms during our interaction. The suggestion that my boundary setting might be evidence of cognitive decline was so insulting and manipulative that I felt my blood pressure rise. Janet's attempt to recruit my friends as allies in her campaign to pathologize my independence revealed the lengths to which my family was willing to go to avoid acknowledging their own problematic behavior. "How did you respond?" I told her that you seemed more mentally sharp and emotionally healthy than you had in years, and that anyone who interpreted your pursuit of independent interests and balanced relationships as signs of mental illness clearly didn't understand what healthy aging looks like. I also told her that if she was genuinely concerned about family relationships, she might consider examining her own behavior rather than questioning your mental competence. Helen's fierce defense of my choices brought tears to my eyes. Having someone advocate for me publicly when my own family was spreading rumors about my mental health felt like a gift I hadn't known I needed. "Eleanor," Helen continued, "I think you should know that Janet's approach to me wasn't casual or spontaneous. She had talking points prepared, specific examples of your concerning behavior ready to share. This feels like a coordinated campaign to undermine your credibility and pressure you back into compliance." The realization that my family was actively working to damage my reputation in the community rather than examining their own behavior was devastating but also clarifying. It confirmed that they saw my independence as a threat to be neutralized rather than a positive development to be supported. That afternoon, I received a visit from someone I hadn't expected. My oldest grandson, Michael's 16-year-old son Jake. He appeared at my door looking uncomfortable but determined, clearly on a mission he wasn't entirely comfortable with. "Grandma," he said when I invited him in, "Dad sent me to talk to you about what's been happening with the family. He thinks maybe you'll listen to me since we've always been close." I felt a surge of anger at Michael's willingness to use his son as a messenger in his campaign to manipulate me back into compliance. The idea that he would involve a teenager in adult relationship conflicts, rather than addressing the issues directly, revealed another layer of his selfishness and emotional immaturity. "Jake," I said gently, "what did your father tell you about our situation?" "He said you've been acting differently lately, that you're not returning phone calls and you've been saying hurtful things about the family not appreciating you enough. He said you might be having some kind of emotional crisis that's making you see problems where none exist." The way Jake repeated his father's characterization of my boundaries as hurtful behavior and emotional crisis confirmed that Michael was deliberately misrepresenting the situation to gain sympathy and support. Rather than explaining that I'd asked for balanced relationships, he'd portrayed me as someone making unreasonable demands and behaving irrationally. "Jake, can I tell you my side of the story? Can I explain what's really been happening? And why I've made some changes in how I interact with your parents?" "Sure, Grandma. I mean, I love you and I want to understand what's going on." For the next hour I explained to Jake the difference between one-sided and balanced relationships. I gave him specific examples of how communication with his parents had become entirely focused on their needs, how I'd begun to feel like a service provider rather than a family member, how my attempts to express these concerns had been dismissed as evidence of mental instability. Jake listened with the kind of attention that reminded me why I'd always enjoyed his company. Unlike his parents, he seemed genuinely interested in understanding my perspective, rather than simply waiting for his turn to present counter-argument. When I finished,
He was quiet for a long time, clearly processing what I'd told him. "Grandma," he said finally, "can I ask you something? When was the last time Dad called you just to see how you were doing?" Not because he needed something. I realized that Jake was instinctively asking the same questions I'd been asking his parents. Naturally understanding that healthy relationships required mutual care and interest. "I can't remember the last time that happened," I admitted. Jake nodded thoughtfully. "Yeah, that's kind of what I figured. I've noticed that when we talk about you at home, it's usually because we need something from you, or because Dad is frustrated that you're not available to help with something. We don't really talk about you as a person with your own life and interest." His observation, coming from someone with no agenda beyond understanding the situation, carried tremendous weight. Jake had noticed patterns in his family's treatment of me that they themselves were unable or unwilling to acknowledge. "Grandma, do you think things could get better between you and Dad? Do you think he could learn to treat you differently?" "I don't know, Jake. Change is possible, but only if people acknowledge that change is needed. Your father seems convinced that I'm the problem, that my expectations are unreasonable rather than my treatment being unfair. It's hard to improve a relationship with someone who doesn't believe there's anything wrong with their behavior." Jake left that day with a promise to think about our conversation, and to pay attention to how his family talked about and treated me. His willingness to consider my perspective, honestly, combined with his genuine concern for my well-being, gave me hope that the next generation might be more capable of balanced relationships than their parents. 3 weeks later, Jake called me with an update that was both heartening and heartbreaking. "Grandma," he said, "I've been watching how our family talks about you since our conversation, and you're right. It's always about what we need from you or complaints about you not being available to help with something. Nobody ever asks how you're doing, or talks about you like you're a real person with your own life." His confirmation of my observations from an inside perspective validated everything I'd been trying to explain to his parents. Jake had spent 3 weeks deliberately paying attention to family dynamics and had reached the same conclusions I'd been trying to share. "I tried to talk to Dad about it," Jake continued, "but he got really angry and said I didn't understand adult relationships. He said you were manipulating me by playing the victim, and that I shouldn't let you turn me against my own family." Michael's response to his son's observations revealed the depth of his unwillingness to examine his own behavior. Rather than considering that Jake might have noticed legitimate problems, Michael had immediately assumed manipulation and attempted to shut down the conversation. "Jake," I said, "I want you to know that I never intended to put you in the middle of this situation. Your father was wrong to send you to convince me to change my boundaries, and I was wrong to burden you with details about adult relationship problems." "No, Grandma, I'm glad you told me the truth. I'm 16, not 6. I can handle knowing about family problems, and I think I deserve to understand what's really happening, rather than being fed the version that makes Dad look good." His maturity in handling complex family dynamics contrasted sharply with his parents' emotional manipulation and refusal to engage honestly with legitimate concerns. Over the following months, my relationships with my children settled into a new pattern. Michael maintained his position that I was being unreasonable and manipulative, occasionally reaching out when he needed practical help, but showing no interest in addressing the fundamental problems in our relationship. Sarah continued to express hurt and confusion about my boundaries, while making no effort to change her own behavior. David mostly ignored the situation entirely, reaching out only when he needed financial assistance or practical support. The distance was painful, but it was also liberating. For the first time in my adult life, I wasn't constantly worried about my children's problems, constantly available for their crises, constantly monitoring their needs, and trying to anticipate ways to help them. I had space to focus on my own interests, my own relationships, my own goals and dreams. I threw myself into learning Italian and eventually planned a trip to Italy with a group from my language class. I developed my watercolor painting skills and began selling small pieces at local art fairs. I expanded my volunteer work at the Literacy Center and became a mentor for other women navigating difficult family transitions. Most importantly, I built new relationships with people who valued me as a complete person, rather than appreciating me solely for my service. My friendship with Helen deepened as we discovered shared interests and compatible perspectives on aging, independence, and personal growth. I reconnected with Alice and other old friends, whose company I'd sacrificed in favor of constant availability to my children. I made new friends through my classes and volunteer work, people who were interested in my thoughts, curious about my experiences, supportive of my goals. The contrast between these balanced relationships and my previous dynamic with my children was stark and enlightening. In my new relationships, care and interest flowed in both directions. People called me because they enjoyed my company, not just because they needed something. They asked about my day, my feelings, my plans, my dreams. They offered help when I was struggling, and celebrated my successes with genuine enthusiasm. 2 years after I'd first set boundaries with my children, Jake graduated from high school and came to visit me before leaving for college. He'd maintained contact throughout the period of family tension, occasionally calling just to chat or stopping by when he was in my neighborhood. His visits had become highlights of my weeks, reminders of what family relationships could look like when they were based on mutual affection rather than obligation. "Grandma," he said during what would be our last visit before he left for school, "I want you to know that watching you these past 2 years has taught me a lot about what healthy relationships should look like. I've seen how happy you are when you're with people who actually care about your thoughts and feelings, and I've learned to recognize the difference between real care and just taking people for granted." His observation gave me hope that the lessons I'd been unable to teach my own children through decades of modeling and sacrifice might be learned by the next generation, through watching me finally value myself enough to demand respect. "I've decided that when I have relationships, I want them to be like the ones you have now," Jake continued. "I want to be with people who are genuinely interested in each other, who support each other's goals, who treat each other like equal. I don't want to be like Dad, expecting people to be constantly available for my needs, without giving anything back." Hearing Jake articulate the values I'd hoped to instill in my children gave me a sense of accomplishment I'd never experienced through their academic or professional success. He had learned to recognize healthy relationship dynamics, not through my words, but through my actions, and finally insisting on being treated with respect. 3 months after Jake left for college, I received an unexpected phone call from Sarah. Her voice was different than it had been during our previous conversations, quieter and less defensive. "Mom," she said, "I've been thinking a lot about our relationship, and some of the things you said about wanting more balance and reciprocal care. I'm calling because I realized I don't actually know very much about your life right now, and I want to understand what you've been doing and how you've been feeling." Her willingness to show genuine curiosity about my life without immediately launching into her own problems was so unexpected that I found myself crying with relief. After 2 years of maintaining boundaries and accepting the possibility that my relationships with my children might never improve, Sarah was finally showing signs of understanding what I'd been asking for. We talked for 2 hours, and for the first time in memory, the conversation was truly balanced. Sarah asked about my art classes, my volunteer work, my travel plans, my thoughts about aging and independence. She listened to my answers with genuine interest, and shared her own reflections on motherhood, marriage, and personal growth. She apologized for dismissing my needs as unreasonable, and expressed genuine desire to build a healthier relationship, based on mutual care and respect. The conversation didn't solve all our problems or erase years of one-sided interactions, but it offered hope that change was possible, when both parties were willing to examine their behavior and commit to treating each other with consideration. By the time I turned 70, my life looked completely different than it had 3 years earlier. I was fluent enough in Italian to have guided conversations with native speakers during my trip to Tuscany. My watercolor paintings were displayed in a local gallery and had attracted a small but enthusiastic following. My volunteer work had expanded to include mentoring other women who were learning to set boundaries with family members who took them for granted. Most importantly, I was surrounded by people who valued my company, respected my independence, and treated me as an equal partner in balanced relationships. I had learned the difference between being needed and being appreciated, between providing services and sharing love, between accepting crumbs and demanding the full respect I deserve. My children's responses to my transformation varied, but all of them had been forced to confront the reality that I was no longer available as their unlimited support system. Michael continued to resist change but had begun showing slightly more consideration for my time and interest. David had slowly begun reaching out for reasons beyond immediate need, though our relationship remained somewhat surface level. Sarah had made the most progress, working actively to create the kind of balanced relationship I'd been requesting. The journey hadn't been easy, and there were moments when I'd wondered if losing my children's approval was too high a price to pay for my independence, but looking back, I realized that I hadn't lost their love by setting boundaries. I'd discovered that what I'd mistaken for love had actually been dependence, and what they'd mistaken for my neediness had actually been my natural desire for reciprocal care and consideration. I'd learned that being called too needy for wanting basic respect and interest was a manipulation tactic used by people who benefited from one-sided relationships. I'd discovered that redirecting my attention toward better heirs, people who genuinely valued my company and contributions, had enriched my life immeasurably, while also creating space for my family relationships to potentially improve. Most importantly, I'd learned that my worth as a person wasn't dependent on my usefulness to others, that my needs for connection and consideration were legitimate and deserving of respect, and that setting boundaries wasn't selfish, but necessary for maintaining my dignity and emotional well-being. At 70, I was finally living the kind of life I'd spent decades helping others build, rich with meaningful relationships, engaged with personal interests, filled with people who saw me as valuable for who I was, rather than grateful for what I provided. It had taken me 7 decades to learn to value myself enough to demand the respect I deserved, but the lesson had transformed not only my own life, but had begun to positively influence the next generation, who was watching me model what healthy relationships could look like. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.